And we're live.
Awesome. Welcome everyone to this Web3Con panel on public goods, the future of public goods. I have some esteemed panelists, Scott, Carl, and Alicia here today, and we're gonna talk about what each of us is doing in public goods today and looking forward into the future of public goods. And we're gonna keep it pretty light and see if we can't surface some actionable opportunities for you, the audience, and maybe come up with some cool ideas. So I know that each of us has been working on public goods for a while and has initiatives, and I want to make sure that I give the space to show them. I think is very important. So Carl, why don't you get us started? Where's your attention today, public goods wise?
Sounds good. Okay, so I am Carl. I'm an optimist over at Optimism. Shocking, surprise, surprise. And what we are doing is we are taking the kind of network that is Optimism, the layer 2 protocol, optimistic rollup, and then taking the fees that are generated from that network and repurposing them to fund public goods. So what does that mean? We're using this like specific kind of retroactive public goods funding mechanism, which is a little crazy. It basically says that you fund public goods that have already been created to incentivize people to start investing in them. So that is kind of where our head is at. It's taking the network protocol profits and repurposing them to fund public goods and hopefully stimulate a kind of a new coalition of bulls that are public goods bulls that will invest in these public goods. So I think everyone here is public goods bulls, but we need to spread the love. So.
Well, we've got a lot of projects spreading the love around for sure. I'm sure Scott has plenty to say about spreading it around. If you please, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Scott. I work at Gitcoin, and we've been focused on funding public goods actually for as long as I can remember now. I feel like it's been like 4 years or something like that. Like the time is just like flying by. But I think to Carl's point, we're at this inflection point in the space where we can really start to accelerate how we fund public goods to a point where I actually think it'll become the sort of dominant narrative in the next like year or two. For the space. And you can kind of see that with regenerative economics, regenerative finance. But for us, what we've been doing is this idea of quadratic funding, in which the community can basically delegate their funding to determine where a pool of matching funds is distributed. So it's a kind of democratic, community-based way to allocate funding according to a broader community's preference. And ultimately, we've run 12 rounds of that, which is kind of a lot, but the goal of running those rounds is principally to figure out how we experiment better with this mechanism, which, as we'll get to, has a lot of pros and a lot of cons. And I think that ultimately what we're doing with Grants Round 13 is starting to accelerate the types of public goods we're funding beyond just Web3 to goods that are in sort of quote unquote, like the real physical world, like the space that we all actually exist in, as much as we might like to talk about, the notion of the metaverse. So that's what we've been up to in a nutshell, and I would love to dive in deeper, but maybe I'll just quickly pass it, to Alicia to talk a bit about the ENS side of things.
Yeah, I'm Alicia.eth, and I work on community at ENS. And actually, the fact that ENS is a public good is one of the reasons why I was really excited to take on a role there. And I think that it's a really interesting space, not only with this idea of public goods, especially digital public goods, which we're quite used to in kind of the traditional Web2 world, but combining this idea of public goods with DAOs and community ownership and decentralized governance and all these like other sorts of mechanisms. It means that when we talk about public goods, it's actually like a really broad topic that has like a lot of flow-on effects. I think like maybe traditionally we take for granted, I don't know that we take it for granted actually, I don't know, some people do, I'm sure I was one of those people, when a government funds public goods in the real world, And so I think it's really interesting, kind of just like based on my own experience from creating content and a podcast, which I kind of created in the vein of being a public good, and going through a grants round, working at ENS, going through the ENS DAO launch and stuff like that. Just kind of based on my own experience, I've gone through the process of like really thinking deeply about what a public good is, first of all, and what kind of the definition is, and then how it applies to Web3. And then it's been really incredible actually to kind of watch, I talk about this all the time, but basically like on the spectrum of public goods and Web3, to have like Gitcoin at one end with grants rounds that kind of are both retroactive and forward looking, and then Optimism at the other end with retroactive grants, and just like the many different approaches. And now with the ENS DAO, I'm really excited to kind of experiment with all that space in the middle, and to kind of just like keep finding ways, one, to better define public goods in Web3, because the point is that like the more context people have around what a public good is, the better decisions that we can make with how money is allocated. And also people have more context to raise funds in the first place, whether that's from like a protocol, an organization, a company, or an individual. So yeah, that's kind of where my head's at with public goods at the moment.
Yeah, context and narrative are definitely very important. We all talk about public goods all the time, but very often someone will have to interrupt me and be like, what are you talking about? Like, what's Web3? What's a public good? And I'm like, I missed a beat here. And in the public library at Gitcoin, one of the most interesting comments on this that I absorbed was that the goods define the public in many of the cases. And I thought that really stuck with me. So I guess I should introduce myself also. I'm Ryan, coordinator. I'm working with Developer DAO. I'm co-leading our operations, and we're following in the footsteps of ENS DAO, setting up our foundation and using a lot of their guidance. So big thanks, big shout out there. And we're hoping to make that path a lot smoother for those who come after us as well. It's tough. It's much more challenging than I expected, but I mean that goes for everything that we're doing. So one question that I'd like us all to try to address is, what is the most important immediate action we can take in the public goods space to support and accelerate public goods orgs? So I know that we're funding them. Funding is great. How else can we support them? My answer to this is through the public goods school, where we're training people who want to work in public goods orgs and creating work placements so people can get experience and connections. And so I'm working from a sort of a social and labor supply angle, but I'd love to hear how everyone else is approaching this kind of question, because I know the grants rounds and the retroactive funding need projects to fund. And I'm curious about how getting them in is looking. Maybe Scott, you can speak to how you're supporting those orgs in the early days.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think you touched on two, or collectively we touched on actually two really important pieces, which is narrative and context. And narrative is important because ultimately we're in this sort of, large scale system of projects, which through the, wonders of social media is very chaotic at times. There's many things going on. There's a lot of noise. It's very difficult sometimes to get a sense of what the true sort of value being created could be or might look like in the future. And I'd actually shout out specifically to my co-founder, Kevin Iwaki, who I think folks are familiar with, like for kind of popularizing this notion of a solar punk future, or of a kind of, regenerative economic future. And I think that narrative is really key because it rallies us around a narrative that ultimately kind of drowns out, for a large portion of, crypto Twitter or whatever communities people are involved in, a lot of that background noise. So on the one hand, I think that's an important piece. And then to Alicia's point, I think it's actually really fundamental for, in the context of that narrative, us to very practically define what a public good actually is. What are we actually trying to fund? What do we want to see long term in the ecosystem? And so in terms of how we've been doing that, each round that we run is actually run by the community, which is something that wasn't true 6 rounds ago, which we run around a quarter, so that was forever ago actually at this point. But ultimately, the fact that the community is running those rounds mean that they get to kind of define what grantees are involved, and they get to define what the parameters are for inclusion. And that gives us this sort of map of the impact that the space wants to see. And you can almost imagine like a sort of, overlapping series of sort of like Venn diagram style circles, where eventually we learn kind of the intersections of the crypto space, and we learn what we want to ultimately see in terms of our values, in terms of our true actions towards progress. And I think that ultimately that's a really useful kind of heuristic map of like Web3, and it's something that we've been trying to actually formalize even beyond the funding into a kind of impact DAO map for the space. And so that's something that I think, in the context of this narrative building is really important. I also fully agree with the idea of providing more support beyond funding to grantees. Many grantees, for example, don't know, like, how do I promote myself? How do I make sure people know what I'm doing? How do I educate people? And I think that, the work that you're doing, Ryan, the work that everyone here is doing is really fundamental to that point. Before I ramble more, though, I'll just pause and let other folks jump in. I think it's a really important question.
Alicia, you mentioned narrative, and I'm wondering, you must have to explain how ENS supplies public goods all the time. When you're explaining it to people who don't understand already, and I'm sure all of us have to explain all the time, what do you call normal people, and what is the explanation that you give them?
I don't know what that means. What do I call normal people?
The term muggles has been used.
Okay.
I try not to use this one.
Well, I was gonna also kind of chime in on that previous question, which was, I think that like the number one way we can help people better understand public goods is conversation. I think that in a lot of instances there are already, especially just like starting with a very basic definition of public goods, which open source software falls under, there are incredible developers within the Ethereum community and the broader Web3 community that have already created ridiculous amounts of value to these communities. And a lot of them, like, you wouldn't know their Twitter PFP if it was constantly in your feed. This might be because they're like not the type of people that are like prolific tweeters. They might just be like busy coding. There can be like lots of different reasons, but I think that something that really is important to me is like sharing as many conversations as possible with the people behind these projects, because I think it is really through that human connection and like having enough context to know that there is a heartbeat behind a project is then what resonates when you go to when you see a tweet about an update on that project and then you feel compelled to like it or retweet it. It's like, because when there's an Ethers.js update, that's Rick Moo and you've heard him on a podcast. And so that's kind of like how my brain works in terms of how to kind of just like bring more people on board, and also to kind of amplify and humanize the people that are building, because it's so easy to take for granted all of the infrastructure that is built. And I know there are so many public goods kind of, that Gitcoin relates to or deals with that are even beyond the scope of Ethereum and Web3. But I think that for me, like even just like going through that retroactive funding experiment list and just being like, do I, Alicia, as someone who is like meant to be all into public goods, like, could I name the people in these projects? Like, do I follow them on Twitter? All these like really little things, like they're free, they don't cost time, they cost your attention. And I don't know. So that's how I think about that sort of stuff.
So I think we should give you a plug. So your series is the Public Goods Are Good series, right?
Oh yeah. So Lani Schrock and I do a weekly Twitter space called Public Goods Are Good. And that just kind of evolved out of Scott and I talking about public goods every week, and then deciding to just like take that call public. in a Twitter space. And I think that is the other thing, which is just like, there are a lot of people who are trying to find ways to connect with people, to break into the space, to like break into a community, especially when you know with public goods that your values aligned. All you want is just like someone to open the door so that you can kind of get into the room. And I think that kind of creating space for conversation, whether it is like voice conversations on Twitter Space, or whether it is content created with like space for comments, or posts in Discord or on Twitter, I think that just like creating that space for people to be able to chime in is a big part of the battle as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, there are a lot of good spaces for conversations. Public goods are good, the public library, and we're creating more of them every day. So it's nice to see. You mentioned value alignment, and that's been actually one of my favorite parts of working in Web3 and public goods, is that I can get on a call. Like, I particularly remember this with Carl. Like, I can get on a call and we can be talking about working something out with just pure true faith and like no concern that we have to worry about watching our backs, because we're like so obviously pointed in the same direction already. So yeah, so Carl, Optimism has been supporting with retroactive funding, and what are you thinking about other things you can do for those groups? How you're bringing them in? What kind of outreach and support you're doing with them? I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. So one of the big, there are a couple challenges. There are a couple of things that I think are really important for getting the public goods space to to the next level. First off, I think that what you're kind of doing with the public goods school, and I think there's a bunch of other things that we can do where we support projects that are building public goods, that are building in this collaborative way, like create a network or some kind of ecosystem for these projects that are building public goods. I think that is extremely important, whether that be some like marketing help, recruitment help, legal help, etc. Like there's a bunch that we can do there. And then I think that there's this other thing that is a little bit harder to nail down, and everyone's been talking about narrative a little bit, so I'll chime in that regard. And that is that like I want to create a public goods narrative that is obvious to people why building public goods is a self-interested thing to do, right? Like I want some like selfish public goods creators, like real gnarly public goods creators that are just like down for the cause because they know that's in their best interest. So that's kind of one of the things that we've been trying to think about from a narrative perspective is like, how do we like explain this in such a way that people are like, wow, building public goods is a competitive advantage versus building public goods is like something that you do if you're, just like you want to save the world and whatnot. Like we need the people who want to save the world, right? No question. But we need everybody else who's just in it for, for the, maybe fewer ideological reasons.
So an example, just to make sure that we're getting concrete about it, is like, let's take someone who's building some kind of software company. You want a narrative that could convince them in a single sitting that they should open source their code base and commit 50% of their profits to public goods, and that in doing so they would return more to their stakeholders than if they didn't, something like that.
Exactly. Because I do think that if we work together, it is going to be a positive sum, world I do think we live in a positive sum, world. And so if we do work together a little bit better, then we will be able to grow the pie and hopefully grow the pie faster than a bunch of people that are trying to make more and take more for themselves. And so if we can make it so that, when you're pitching an investor, they're like, wait, so what's your strategy for getting retroactive public goods funding, or like, or what, they're thinking about the projects that they're investing in, or the developers that are building the projects. They're thinking about the projects that they're building as like, obviously I need to be working towards this, bigger, mission. I want to focus on impact. To be very concrete in some sense, like ideally when you're building a project, the first thing that you think of and the last thing that you think of is, how do I make this project have a huge impact? Because having a huge impact will be profitable. That's like kind of where we're trying to push the narrative.
I can imagine supplying a pre-baked slide for people's early slide decks that says like, we're devoted to being a public good for the following reasons, like better access to better developers, easier access to early funding, and these other things. In the software space, I have conversations all the time where I'm like, you should open your code base so you can have access to our developers. And it's like my like personal badge of joy that I was part of the conversation that got Coordinate open sourced. And so I can do that over and over again for like software leaders. I wonder, I have no idea how that conversation goes for like orgs that aren't focused on digital and software. I wonder how that would go.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a really interesting thing. So George Hotz actually said that the reason why he doesn't open source hardware designs is because it actually doesn't, it isn't advantageous to the, like the average person, the average Joe, if there's open source hardware designs. It's really only advantageous to like big companies that are able to like manufacture and compete with the smaller peeps that are open sourcing it. So like, there's actually this weird thing where if you want to be like pro the little person, it's actually better to not open source certain hardware designs, which is like a very strange calculus. You're like, no,
I reject this narrative. Like, there may be an angle from which it's true from a like manufacturing and business point of view, but I buy Librem hardware because I know that I'll be able to read the data sheet. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on Bunny Huang's precursor and getting it for every member of Developer DAO, because like I have the true pure faith about open hardware as well.
Soon, yes. I do definitely in the long term and whatnot. But I do think that there is an interesting kind of like defining, even nailing down what is a public good is like non-trivial in some ways, right? Because you can be doing things that may seem like, if we are like religious about how we define it, then it might just get like, we might miss certain things on the edges and actually like not push forward the industry and the space into the direction that we want. So I don't know. These are these interesting,
I think that's such an important point. And like the definition part in the context, Carl, of what you're saying, I think is really actually worth just like very quickly digging into a little bit more. Because like the traditional definition, I think for most folks don't know, but like it's like non-rivalrous, non-excludable, which just means that like you're effectively you're creating something, or you're funding something that is available to everyone and can't be taken away from them. So clean air is a good example of this, where you're not going to be able to really like bottle up clean air and like try and take it away from someone else. It's generally accessible to everyone. The climate is another example of kind of a global public good. Open source software is a perfect example in sort of what we've been talking about. But there's this other definition, which Alicia has talked a lot about, which I think is really important, and like would love to have her dive into this a little bit more. But like the idea of positive externalities, which you touched on as well, Carl, like what are we actually generating for the broader community beyond the original sort of like creators in the context of a given public good? And you can think about this in sort of like the DAO context as well, right? We're creating these DAOs. These DAOs have effectively tokens which guarantee that, there's a in-group and an out-group. There's people who are in the DAO and there are people who are not in the DAO. But although that seems on the face of it like maybe a bad thing, like there's people who definitely criticize the notion that, maybe you're creating a cooperative, or maybe you're creating a kind of, a sort of club. The idea that this club is, kind of like an issue or sort of like is a, in-group without value excludes the notion that there is this positive externality. And so that positive externality like really is the key piece to unlocking the idea that in the example I gave, which is very esoteric about these overlapping circles of sort of like different DAOs or different communities deciding their own sets of public goods, what's missing from that picture is the fact that like every time you create one of these intersections, there's this much broader circle. You can almost, I wish I had like almost like a little diagram of like a dotted line that gets formed around that intersection that like is producing this like local set of positive externalities. And Ostrom talks about this in the context of commons. Like, so one thing that we'll probably get to deeper later is just this idea of what does the global commons look like and how do DAOs facilitate that reshaping of, the idea of public goods to a global commons with positive externalities. So I don't know if that's getting us way too deep down the rabbit hole too quickly, but I really think that's like a key point that is often missed in Web3.
Positive externalities for the global commons. I'm there for it.
Yeah, I definitely do agree, Scott. I also think about it this weird way. I don't know. I'm a math person, and so I just think about it in this specific way where there's like all of these little communities, and they all have their like, impact judgment vectors, and they're all like pointing in slightly different ways. And then if you average all of the like impact judgment vectors, then you get this like global impact judgment vector. Like what this global thing is like, what is the digital commons good? Like what is a good for the digital commons? And then, that's kind of, so we want to like make sure that we have all these like, sovereign communities that can kind of judge and reward their own impact. But then we also need to aggregate that impact into this like, some kind of global metric reward scheme thing. So anyway, it's a little abstract, but
I feel like, Carl, when you were on Crypto Native, I feel like we talked about this, and I think the analogy that we kind of landed on was this idea that if you think about like public goods as like water in an ocean and like an individual localized public being a bay. And so like the ocean across the world is made up of like many different bays. That's like all it is, right? But collectively it's an ocean. And so like you can zoom out and you're looking at water. But when you like really look into it, when you think about even just like caring for that specific bay and the impact of, the water in that specific area, it's like a very localized approach. And I think kind of taking something I think about as well, like
this is
no.
The magic of the internet.
I just want to note though, like in the interim that like that was a much more succinct like analogy, like the ocean analogy already. Like we like both went into like this like really like here's like the vectors. That's like a very good way, like precise analogy and way to put it. But yeah, let's see, Alicia, if you can make it back. Fingers crossed.
Well, while we wait for her to reconnect, simple analogies that normal humans can understand in 5 minutes. Oh, it looks like you're back. It looks like you're back.
My phone went to sleep and I'm tethering. So I was just going to say that it's 2022 and there are lots of different ways to make money and to monetize things that weren't applicable in the decades before this very year. And we have the internet, and honestly, things like e-commerce have come such a long way in the last like 10 years that when we think about the free rider problem as like as the single basis on which like, we define public goods, it kind of doesn't apply as strictly anymore. And so I personally think it would be like really detrimental to the future of public goods and therefore the future of the world to like not take into account not only like the local communities, but like the time and place and human civilization that we're at. And kind of be a bit more lenient in terms of like the definitions and like what does it look like to not completely start from scratch, but like at least be conscious of like the time and place in which we are existing and trying to solve these problems.
Very, very quickly on that, and I think we'll get to this some point further along too, but in the context of climate in particular, I think that's really, really relevant, where like we've had, for example, all these UN summits for 26 years on the climate, and like we've made, small little like incremental agreements and so forth. And I think it's like really important for us to think about like, hey, like we have a long way to go to like improve where we are now, but we're already making significantly more progress than these 26 summits did as like a global community of like just individuals trying to like work towards this. And that's just in the context of like, we're thinking about this in the context of Gitcoin's climate round and so forth. But I think that's a really good example of a global coordination problem that like was kind of outside the scope of a public in a local, like, for example, a national environment. Like for the most part, countries are not interested in coordinating on this thing that they could have someone else focus on versus having themselves focus on. And I think that's going to be, although it's not as pernicious yet, the same with open source software in the next 20 years. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. I just think that's really important to like highlight like how early we are in this process.
Yeah, specifically for governments and free and open source software, I'm looking forward to seeing what the like standard operating software for a government will be 50 years from now. Like in my dreams, it's all free and open source, but the struggle is going to be real. I know there were some stories in Germany about I believe it was Munich decided to run everything on Linux and free and open source, and in response, Microsoft moved their local headquarters there to like try to lobby that decision back. And so globally coordinating on questions like this is definitely long term. I want to come back to like the bays and oceans example is very easy to understand. Like I can see it, anyone can see it. I would love if we could talk a little bit more about like easy to understand examples like that. Because I know it's just like a long-standing problem is to get the ideas simple enough that they can be conveyed. On Friday, we had Developer DAO and Gitcoin got together for Memapalooza, which we do every month to try to make ideas simple enough to show up on, my goal is my mom's Instagram, that like a public goods meme will show up there and she'll understand it. But I think we're still a long way off. So there's the bays and oceans example, Alicia. Do you have any others that are really simple and impactful that you've gotten good mileage out of?
Not off the top of my head, but I do know that like when Carl and I spoke, I think in like August last year, that like really resonated with me. And I think it is also just like having a diversity of people in the room thinking about public goods. And so Carl and Scott are both like very technical people, whereas I am very not technical. And like for us to get to a place where I can interpret and like translate the technical aspects of what is trying to be communicated in a way that, I could go to a shopping mall and like tell someone about it, I think is definitely part of the challenge, but also why it's like good to have lots of different people in the room trying to figure this out.
I'm really trying to think of like still something that's like very concrete, like very simple. I guess maybe, one example really is like a university, right? When you think of education, and this is just going back to the positive externalities framing, universities can be public, they can be private, they can have all kinds of configurations, but what they produce is education, and education is itself a public good in the sense that everyone sort of gets the ability to hopefully understand their, not only their like local, economies, their systems better, but hopefully they can, get more value for themselves to that process as well. It's like partly you should want to be educated because it is also sort of a selfish decision to be able to do more in the world, right? So there's this benefit from the university. And I think that like thinking about how can we build more sort of, collective global institutions like the university is maybe one other framing. I still feel it's not quite as concrete as the ocean analogy, but like I think it's maybe one that's worth noting.
Yeah, I did write about Kernel, which is a Web3 learning community that spun out of Gitcoin, that runs 8-week blocks every couple of months for 250 to 300 people. And I think that because of this idea of like non-excludable and non-rivalrous, kernel wouldn't be considered a traditional public good, because when you go through the program, like you're excluding someone and like it's not a public good by the traditional definition. But if you were to say like use this matrix of market failure and value to the community, then because of the value it provides to the community, and that could be defined in a lot of different ways. But one way I think about it is that when I think about the impact of people who come out of the kernel program, even though it's not open source, and it's not completely public and open, the impact of those people and the value to the community of like those people being involved in projects, starting projects, contributing and being in the space is a huge public good. And they like literally go on to build public goods. And so to kind of extinguish like kernel from the opportunity of funding because it's not like technically a public good based on the standard economics definition, the flow-on effects of that, I think we almost like can't even quite comprehend it. If you're thinking like 250 people a couple of times a year, that's like 1,000 people. I mean, there aren't that many. I know there are a lot of founders in Web3, but like it's like it could have a huge impact, like a meaningful number impact in terms of like the people in the space, the people creating projects, all this sort of stuff. So I think this idea of like education and especially when we start talking about like this idea of public and open source, I know it's like, Ryan, I feel like you feel really strongly about this. Like the default is that it has to be like open source for it to be public. But I kind of feel personally, having gone through that experience, that I would push back on that because the value to that public within that like small context is immense in itself. But then when you take that small public and you put them into the broader ecosystem, that is also like a really big value to the community. So there are just like little things like this. A word that I have been thinking about a lot lately, just like in the context of being in Web3, is the word nuance. And I think that like, what does it mean to think about public goods in Web3 with the term nuance like plastered on a whiteboard in front of our face?
Yeah, one way that I've been trying to think of public goods really is just this meme of like impact equals profit. Just like you have an impact, you should have a commensurate profit. Like impact to the collective equals profit to the individual. As much as we can like create that as an axiom that we live by, then everyone can start focusing on impact. And guess what? The net, like everyone focusing on having a positive impact is the ultimate public good. So that's like, yeah, just impact equals profit. Make it real, please, Lord.
I think that's this other thing within like the traditional definition of public goods, which is like the idea of profit is villainized. And I think this is like the opportunity that we also have in Web3, which is this idea that like everyone profiting is a positive thing, and that it can be positive sum for like everyone, especially financially, to win. I think there's another thing about public goods and social impact. It's like, oh, you have to be the good guy, i.e. the poor guy. And so, I think that there is like such an opportunity in terms of like redefining these really like steadfast paradigms. And they feel like as old as time in terms of, just like the norms that have been established. And I think there are such opportunities, especially around this idea of profit that Carl is talking about.
One very quick example, even though it hasn't failed, but it's certainly had its challenges with KlimaDAO. Like I think that like the idea of something like that in which you're effectively building, in their case, like a DeFi protocol whose entire goal is to hopefully enable a reduction in carbon in the world is like a really great example of like everyone who's contributing is kind of like in this self-interested DeFi game, but they're doing it for this impact, which like ends up being net positive for everyone. And that's like a really, like tangible example, although probably requires a bit of understanding of DeFi in a way that is tangential. I'm still not going to get quite to like the precise analogy. I think that's a really important, set of like primitives that we should start exploring more generally beyond just these one-off cases.
Strong agree.
Yeah, I think we're all pretty aligned on that one. Alicia, I wanna say that nuance is super important, and there's definitely a lack of it going around. And I will own that my position is very like freedom maximalist. Like that's okay. I take criticism on that all the time.
That wasn't meant to be that wasn't meant to be a hardcore dig.
No, it's
I think it was
I don't
just
take it as a dig at all. It's just like
yeah.
a
I think something else that I think about is in terms of like this idea of nuance and like the periphery and the boundaries and things like that, which is like when we think about scientific innovation, technological innovation, like a lot of this stuff historically, in terms of like what moves us forward as like civilization, not even just a society, which I think is like a time and place thing. These breakthroughs that happen on the periphery, and everyone is like so concerned about looking at the bullseye, and you're like, that's cool right now because like that's what we have the most understanding around, like the most context and all these things, but you don't know what obscure random thing that, if we do broaden like the definition of public goods in Web3, would like scrape in to a retroactive funding round this year, and like the impact that it could go on to have. And so yeah, that I think that's like how I think about nuance as well. It's like it's not always so binary. I think that yeah, whether it's like when you're thinking about like a bullseye and concentric circles and like moving outwards, or like a spectrum, just like even just like breaking that mold of like how we think about things is a win.
I love it. We've got 5 minutes left, and I'd love to talk about things that we're seeing early days at the periphery that we might bring in. So you mentioned Kernel. I was at their office hours on Friday. There's no way that I'm going to deny that Kernel is going to produce huge positive externalities. So if we can get them into funding rounds, and if we can't, then like what is the class of things there? And what else fits into that class that we can create a fund for. I'm very interested in exploring this because I am such a maximalist, and I'm all day I'm like, that doesn't count as public goods, that doesn't count. But like, so the kernel produces people that are going to go on and make an impact. What are some of the other, what other things are we excited about?
I'm very excited about retroactive public goods funding. I'll show that. Now, one thing I want to just highlight one project which is going to be putting out some announcements soon and has been really impactful in the space and is often probably forgotten about is Wallet Connect, which is very, very, again, I'm not going to go to the most like practical examples, but if you use Rainbow Wallet, if you use anything out there, you're using Wallet Connect pretty much. The benefits of that have been massive for the space. And although they've been funded, via Gitcoin for a long time, there's also this question of like, what is the value that they're creating actually worth? And that's the retroactive public goods sort of like funding question. And I guess for me, like what I'm very interested to see in that class of sort of like infrastructure that's been so important for so long is, how do we do both? How do we basically like not just fund them upfront, but also find a way to measure, like to Carl's point, the commensurate impact that they have? So I'll shout out to Wallet Connect, but I just wanted to also kind of like slide in that like important point, because I know we touched on that earlier, but I think it's really just like good to differentiate. Like one of the things about upfront funding is, it gets immediate funding to people who need it. Retroactive public goods funding gets large commensurate value for impact produced. And there's like that distinction that I think is really important in like how we think about these programs.
It's kind of weird as well when you think about the context. Like most of us can't comprehend what it means for like to understand that open source software creates. What is Kevin Owalki has like a number? I don't know if it's 50 billion. It's like it's an insane number.
It might even be more than that now. Yeah, I think it could be in the hundreds of billions of dollars at this point. Yeah, it's crazy.
Right, so it's a really big number, like a bigger number than most of us would ever have to wrap our heads around in like a day-to-day scenario. And so then when it comes to attributing value to those things, like especially open source software, I think that, and this is something else I talked about to Carl about, which is like, I kind of want to see people who are building open source projects and public goods that have created a lot of value, like at least remunerated and compensated like to the level of an athlete or an influencer or like all of these people in this day and age that are able to like effectively capture the value because of like the tools and mechanisms that we now have. And I don't know if that's like just a tool thing or it's like a narrative thing again. But I think just like the number should be big. I think like we should plant that seed, like the number should be big.
Exactly. And we got more fully open source projects. I'm very excited for when I know it's kind of ridiculous, but when they allow people to invest in them to like, and then we can, properly reward those investments. Anyway, the project tokens, the project tokens idea, where if you have a open source project that you want to create, you create a small set of, let's say, NFTs, then you can sell those NFTs to people who are bullish about your great public goods that you're creating, and then someone will retroactively reward all the investors, including of course, the actual developers. So I'm very excited for that. But we do need to create the bulls. The bulls, I think, come first. The public goods bulls. So everyone on this call, tell your friends about how public goods are great for the world and also will make you personally wealthy. Even though, we have some work to get there. We got to get there, but we're on our way.
This is not investment advice. Let's
this is true.
But I do really think this idea of like, again, like these, I keep trying to think about this mental model, which is too esoteric, but like the idea of these, cooperatives, we're basically creating these like individual cooperatives that then like nest into each other, like to create this like nested global commons, like that sort of framework really to me like just makes it obvious that, Carl, like what you're saying is logically where we'll end up in the future of public goods funding. And I think so long as we make sure that the mechanisms by which those cooperatives are governed are standardized and sort of like that we are able to sort of evolve those processes over time, I think we'll be in a very strong position like 20 years from now when it's, increasingly, in my view, necessary to have them.
Oh, we covered a lot of ground today. I feel like it's my responsibility to cap it off, even though we could go on for many hours. So thank you very much, everyone for watching and everyone for participating. And let's take that final note and run with it. Everyone at Developer DAO, let's start tokenizing our projects and treating our devs like superstar athletes. I love it. We'll definitely lean into that more. Thank you for everyone for coming out to Web3Con and talking about public goods. And let's go wave the flag, get that bull run more dense. Let's go. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks so much.